Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating piece of ancient history, one that honestly carries a super powerful message. We're looking at an incredible story of absolute, utter ruin, followed by a shockingly rapid recovery. And the whole thing hinges on a really simple yet profound action: opening closed doors to spark a sudden restoration. We're going to look at how an entire nation's trajectory shifted practically overnight just because one young leader decided to unlock what had been bolted shut for an entire generation. Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine the absolute epicenter of your society, right? The place of highest cultural and spiritual significance, just totally boarded up. What actually happens to a nation when its temple doors are completely sealed shut? Well, in the ancient kingdom of Judah, the temple in Jerusalem wasn't just a building. It was the beating heart of their identity, their community, and of course, their connection to God. And when that heart stopped beating, the entire nation went into a catastrophic freefall. Which brings us to Section 1, Closed Temple and Fallen Judah. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this crisis, we have to look at the first era of our timeline, zeroing in on the dark reign of King Ahaz. The historical text of Second Chronicles pulls absolutely zero punches here. King Ahaz didn't just, neglect the temple because he was busy running a country. No, he actively and intentionally dismantled it. He gathered up the secret furnishings, literally hacked them to pieces, and firmly shut those heavy doors of the Lord's temple. He completely banned the worship that had been central to his people for centuries, plunging the house of God and, by extension, the whole nation into total darkness. Now, Judah had definitely seen its fair share of bad rulers before this. Wicked rulers like Queen Athaliah had for sure introduced corruption. But in previous eras, the problem was usually syncretism, kind of mixing other religions like Baal worship with their own, or maybe misusing the temple items. Ahaz, though, he was entirely different. He was the very first ruler in the history of the Davidic line to attempt a total, absolute shutdown of the temple's function. He didn't just pollute the worship, he tried to erase it entirely, replacing it with idols on literally every street corner. And the closure of those doors had immediate, catastrophic national consequences. We aren't just talking about a religious shift here. This was a full-blown societal collapse. The historical records in Chapter 28 show us that this spiritual abandonment led directly to devastating military defeat. Think about this. A staggering 200,000 wives and children were taken captive by their enemies. 200,000! The nation was in absolute ruin, completely stripped of its defenses and just engulfed in widespread fear. The family unit, the nation itself, it was all crumbling because their foundational core had been abandoned. That leads us right into Section 2, Hezekiah's very first work. History can turn on a dime when new leadership steps up. Enter Hezekiah. He takes the throne at just 25 years old. Think about what most 25-year-olds are doing today. But Hezekiah, he was tasked with essentially uncanceling a national religion. He inherited a completely broken, defeated, and spiritually dead nation from his father, Ahaz. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast in leadership here. You have the destructive legacy of the father on one side, smashing vessels and locking doors, and on the exact opposite side, you have the immediate restorative actions of the son, who steps into power and gets straight to work opening those doors and repairing the temple. It's such a powerful picture of how quickly a legacy of ruin can be challenged by a leader who is determined to rebuild. Just look at this timeline for a second, because it really highlights Hezekiah's extreme urgency. He becomes king, and in his very first year, actually in the very first month of his reign, he immediately opens those doors. He didn't say, hey, let's fix the military first to get our captives back, or let's patch up the economy. He intuitively understood that the root cause of the nation's collapse was spiritual. He tackled the restoration of worship before doing absolutely anything else. Moving on to Section 3, Differences between Kings and Chronicles. This brings us to a really intriguing bit of literary analysis. The story of Hezekiah is actually told in two different ancient texts, but they focus on entirely different things. While the book of 2 Kings focuses on Hezekiah as this fierce warrior and a bold reformer who destroyed idols and fended off the massive Assyrian Empire, the book of 2 Chronicles takes a totally different angle. Chronicles dedicates 3 entire chapters almost exclusively to his meticulous restoration of the temple, the cleansing process, and the reinstatement of worship. So why the huge difference? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is who these books were actually written for. The Book of Chronicles was written much later, specifically for returning exiles who had just come out of Babylonian captivity. Picture this. These readers had no king, no army, and their beloved city was literally nothing but ruins. They desperately needed to know how to rebuild a nation entirely from scratch. They didn't need military strategies at that point. They needed to know the foundational starting point of their national identity. And that leads right to this core thesis from our source material. True national restoration begins with the restoration of worship. The author of Chronicles is telling these returning exiles, look, if you want to rebuild this ruined society, you can't start with walls and weapons. You have to start with the temple. You have to start with your connection to God. Which brings us to Section 4, Renewal of the Levites' Calling. Let's transition to the human element of this restoration, which honestly is incredibly moving. We're going to focus on the people who had essentially lost their life's purpose when those temple doors were bolted shut, the priest and the Levites. Just imagine being a Levite during this time. Your duty, which you inherited by bloodline for generations, is to serve in the temple, to tend the lamps, to sing the music of David. But for decades, the doors are locked, the lamps are out. Your life's calling has been forcibly paused by wicked government. What do you even do? You probably drift into despair, take on other jobs, and start feeling like your sacred calling has just simply expired. But then King Hezekiah gathers them in the eastern square, and notice his words here. My sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him. It's so beautiful that this young 25-year-old king addresses these older men as sons, stepping into this paternal restorative role. He's reminding them that despite those long, dark decades of a paused life, God's calling on them was never canceled. His choice was absolutely still valid. In his speech, Hezekiah brings up a vital word, covenant. He understood that restoring the temple wasn't just a physical construction project, it was a matter of the heart. He wasn't just fixing a building or reinstituting a specific format of worship. He was resolving the deep heart issue of an entire generation that had turned its back on God. A covenant in this context is a deeply renewed promise, a deliberate turning of the face back to God after a really long period of looking away. All right, Section 5, God's prepared sudden restoration. This leads us to the absolute climax of this historical event, the miraculous, almost unbelievable speed of this national recovery once the people align their hearts and finally open those doors. 16. That is the number of days it took to cleanse the temple. I mean, think about how long it takes just to renovate a modern kitchen, right? Now imagine clearing out decades of accumulated national ruin and idolatry in just over 2 weeks. A mess that took a whole generation to make was cleaned up in exactly 16 days. They restored the proper sacrifices and brought the majestic music of David right back to Jerusalem. The ancient text highlights this speed perfectly, and Hezekiah rejoiced because the thing came about suddenly. That word suddenly is just so powerful. From a human perspective, if you look at the decades of rot and ruin, rebuilding seemed like it would take lifetimes. Yet a decades-long ruin was completely reversed in the blink of an eye, the very moment those doors were finally opened. So the crucial point for the authors of this text is that this rapid restoration wasn't just the result of extreme human effort or really good organizational skills. The text explicitly says it happened suddenly because God had prepared it for the people. The theological secret to the speed was that God was already standing right behind that closed door, eagerly waiting with this prepared waterfall of grace, just waiting for someone to finally turn the lock. And our final section, Section 6, Restoring Our Worship Today. Because look, this ancient history isn't just a story about a king and a building. The authors intended it to bridge directly into the lives of their readers. For the original post-exilic audience, it meant tangible hope for the ruined city. But looking at the text's message for us today, we can break it down into 3 really actionable steps. First, recognize the closed doors in your life. Have you let the busyness, the fatigue, or maybe the anxieties of life bolt the doors of your spiritual practices shut? Second, renew the covenant in your heart. This isn't about perfectly executing rituals, it's about a sincere turning back. And third, reclaim your place of worship. You just need to step up and open the door, knowing that the restorative grace is already prepared for you. Let's wrap up with a final thought here. The story of Hezekiah presents a really powerful framework. No matter how long the darkness has lasted, and no matter how complete the ruin might seem, restoration can happen suddenly when we respond to the call. The grace is already prepared. Literally, the only thing missing is the willingness to unlock the door. So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. What closed doors in your own life is God eagerly waiting for you to open today? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this sparks a sudden restoration in your own journey.